Our guest is Barry Rubin, with whom you should all be familiar. Thank you very much for returning, Barry. Barry, we're now on to Egypt. And you've said, I think, that here's a country with no resources and lots of population, and that's its problem. And yet it seems to be so central to the Middle East. But you've also indicated that it's not so central anymore. Can you position Egypt in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, it has two resources. It does have oil fields in western Sinai and the Suez Canal, but there's rich agricultural land. So, but clearly the problem of Egypt is that with the size of its population, and remember that population of Egypt inhabits 2% of the country along the Nile River. So there's a major structural problem there. Historically, Egypt was the leading country in the Arab world. Everybody knows that, culturally and every other way. And that's declined in some real ways, but Egypt is still the most populous country. But the real change is in the international picture, that one of the things that Arab writers note is that no Arab state really is of great significance on a regional level anymore. Of course, they'll talk about Iran, Turkey, and Israel in that respect. Egypt was unquestionably leader of the Arab world from, let's say, 1955 to the late 1970s. But because Egypt was going to Egypt basically gave up the struggle to become the leader of the Arab world, in part because the leadership decided it cost too much and brought too little return, and they had to sort of look after their own interests, one of which, of course, was peace with Israel as conducted by Anwar Sadat in 1979, after which Egypt was embargoed by the rest of the Arab world for years. There's no pretense, though, today that Egypt is playing a leading role in the Arab world, but it's important because it's among the moderate states that's facing this Islamist threat and the bid by Iran to become the leader of the Middle East.
I like the joke you told. You told that joke about, I think you credit it to the Egyptians themselves, that when Sadat would always turn left, Nasser would turn right, and when Mubarak got in after Sadat was assassinated, essentially Mubarak said, turn left, turn right, but we'll park. And
yes.
They haven't moved. Have they not really moved or developed? Is that what it meant, story?
There's been some... Well, there are two ways to read that story. One way is the jettisoning of ideology and a more technocratic government. So I think that's accurate. I mean, they have maintained the stability of the country. There's been some progress, but it's a mess. It's like when you go there and you study it, it's sort of a miracle that it survives because the problem is so huge. Population growth has slowed. By the way, it's one of the ingredients that many people miss in the Middle East. The predicted dramatic fall in population growth, although it's still quite high compared to a lot of other places. So Egypt is a country with enormous problems, enormous discontents.
Why has Mubarak not provided for a successor in the usual this kind of military royalty system?
I assume, I can't say for sure, that it's a matter of ego, that he simply can't contemplate giving up power. We're so short on time, the things I can't go into, but if you compare, if he wants his son to be his successor, he has still not named him officially. His son Gamal has played a more important role. But in contrast, in Syria, that Hafez al-Assad, when he was preparing his son, basically put him through a real program of 7 years of training. So Egypt is, as you implied, the coming crisis in the region because Mubarak is going to leave the scene at some point, and who is going to be the successor? His son seems the most likely successor, but by no means is it assured. Now, the opposition in Egypt is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, like other radical Islamist groups, is playing moderate. You can see articles in the Western media how moderate it is.
You think that's just a show?
Well, yeah. I mean, they have an English language site designed to show how moderate they are. In fact, they reprint my articles on their English language site, and when they criticize them, they do so very politely. But look at the Arabic language stuff, and it's very extreme. And in Maria, we had an article by an Egyptian, for example, who talked about what do the Muslim Brotherhood members of parliament propose? Or the Muslim Brotherhood came out with its new program, and all these people wrote in the Western media how moderate it is. And in fact, it's moderate compared to the Taliban, but it's not moderate. The goal is an Islamist state. Now, the tactics they use are much milder. They're much more cautious. They're very patient. They don't use violence within the country, although they advocate terrorism outside of the country. They support Hamas. They advocate terrorism against American forces in Iraq. But why are they so patient, and why don't they use violence within the country? Because they're afraid of the government, which arrests people.
Well, let's take the government itself.
You notice, I'd say one sentence. You notice that in two countries with strong governments, Egypt and Jordan, the Islamists have stuck to elections and haven't gone to violence. But where there's a weaker government, as in the Palestinian Authority and in Lebanon, when they can do what they want, then they go to violent revolutionary activity and terrorism.
Well, let me ask you something about Mubarak, because, and it's the perception, because you have this criticism of the blockade of Gaza, all leveled against Israel. Nothing said that I read about
the truth is,
passage
the truth is that
Egypt's role.
The truth is that the agenda of a lot of people is to attack Israel and blame it for everything, and they don't care about anything else, and that's their goal. And we see this in the West. By the way, one of the important things that's happened in the West, including Canada, is that these movements have been taken over by the Islamists from the nationalists. You don't see demonstrations saying support the Palestinian Authority, give more money to the Palestinian Authority, we want a negotiated two-state solution, it's Israel is a horrible demon, let's destroy it. This is the Islamist line, and it's very clear. But the factor is that we know what these movements say within themselves in their writings and in their goals, and they're extremely radical.
Yeah, but then why doesn't Egypt more overtly, it has a cold peace, why not overtly express its support for what Israel did?
Because they're playing the old game to keep their population happy. This is to use the conflict, to use the radical line. The fact that they made peace with Israel makes it all the more necessary for them to have a heated anti-Israel rhetoric. But again, people don't do their research. In Egyptian schools, despite the fact that Egypt gets $2 billion in aid each year from the U.S. for many years, school children are taught that in 1967, the American Air Force attacked Egypt and destroyed the Egyptian Air Force. All summarized to me by an editorial in Al-Ahram, the leading Egyptian newspaper, state-controlled. It said, all the terrorism in Iraq is American conspiracy to divide the Muslims. So you have this thing in which, while the government may follow a pragmatic policy, that on the level of what they say to the population is extremely inflammatory. And always the danger that may come back one day to haunt them. Because if you've been feeding all this stuff to your people, then how far can you go to do something else? They're tying their own hands. However, in fairness, the Egyptian government, on a number of occasions, they have tried to get the Palestinian Authority to make peace with Israel. They've tried to bring about agreement for years. They wanted to become like the patron of the Palestinian Authority, and they failed. And they gave up in disgust. You should hear what Egyptian officials said about Arafat.
Yeah, I've heard. I've actually heard.
And this story is not. I think they've literally given up trying to push the Palestinians toward a peace with Israel. So why did the Egyptians blockade Gaza? Because Hamas is in league with their own revolutionary Islamists, and they don't want them to succeed. This is not just an Israel issue, it's an Egypt issue. Good example of the theme that I'm trying to explain in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. We really appreciate it.